Welcome to History 109. This week we'll be looking at kind of terminology and ideas before we get into the content itself. Partly because I want you to know these terms so we can apply it to different concepts in different parts of history that we're going to learn. So some of these concepts you might have heard particularly in classes like sociology. That's where you tend to see them, and even philosophy. So we'll be talking about postmodernism. If you've taken philosophy, probably was covered there. And even though we're not going to talk about specifically about Chicano history quite yet, I do want you to know some of these terms. So we're going to skip this slide and go straight. This is something that I use in my Chicano studies class. So if you're taking both classes, you'll recognize this. And typically when we think of when we think of people of Latino descent over here in the United States, these are the different terms that we have. And I quickly want to give you a rundown as to the history of some of these terms. We'll be talking about a few of these as we move forward, but some of them we just don't have the time to. So I quickly want to give you some context as to why certain people use different terms. So if you're new to like ethnic studies and you're like, oh my God, why don't people just use one word or just use American because we're all American? Well, yes and no, right? Yeah. We were born in the United States, but our experience is different from different groups, right, within the United States. So obviously, Asian American history is going to be completely different from Black history, Chicano history, or even your kind of mainstream Anglo-American history, right? So these terms are important because they speak to a time and place of how we saw ourselves throughout history. So the first one is Hispano. This is a term that you still see used today, particularly if you watch Spanish TV, but this is a term that a lot of times it's used in Nuevo Mexico, right? So they begin, particularly in the kind of early 1800s, they begin to see themselves as Hispanos, particularly having that kind of connection to Spain in some shape or form. Either they feel like they're descendants of people from Spain, or that there are these kind of racial undertones where they feel that they're whiter, kind of like a white Mexican. And they tend to use this term to kind of identify each other through this long history that existed in New Mexico. Another term is Latino. Latino is a kind of very general term. It's what we would say an umbrella term. Sorry. And it started to be used in the late part of the 1900s. So 1980s is when it really begins to take off. And it's good and it's bad. So number one, it's good because it allows many people to fall under this umbrella term. So you have, Cuban Americans and Venezolanos and Hondureños and obviously Mexicans, right? But at the same time, our experiences are completely different from each other, right? Me and a Cuban American don't think the same, right? Or a Puerto Rican, right? And a Mexican American are two different things. Not only from geography, but also just the way we think, because we have a different history. So it's a good term to use in a very kind of general way, but it's very problematic when you're trying to talk about specific groups. Though it's becoming much more common. I think they use this word a lot, like in the Midwest, where you have ethnic studies programs. They use like Latino studies. Another term is Mexican American. This word, though many of you might use because you feel, well, my parents are Mexican, I'm American, I'm Mexican American. Well, yes, again, you can identify however you want, but there is a history. And we'll actually spend a couple weeks looking at this particular term and what one historian has defined as the Mexican American generation. And this word is defined in the context of the Great Depression. So prior to the Great Depression, this is a term that might not have been used as much. It still existed, say 1915, but it wasn't as popular as much as it was after the Great Depression. The word Mexican, here's another word that many of you might use just because your parents are Mexican, so it's kind of easy just to identify as Mexican. And if you ever kind of have these debates with your parents, particularly if your parents are from Mexico, you notice that they'll probably tell you, "Oh, no, mijo, you're not Mexican," right? You might have been, your parents might have been from Mexico, and might be from Mexico, but you're nothing like them. They'll probably call you pocho, right? Because you're not from Mexico, so you don't share their kind of experiences, and this becomes a very kind of hot topic in a lot of Mexican households. So it's fine to call yourself whatever you want, but at the end of the day, the experience between a Mexican and Mexican American is going to be different. Other terms are regional terms, such as Tejano. Those of you that are from Texas, for whatever reason, they're very proud to be from Texas. So they use a word to describe who they are. And a lot of times these terms are used, I think Texas might be unique, but a lot of times when you leave the state, that's when these identities become much stronger. And definitely tied to the state of Texas. And for Mexican Americans, it's probably one of the only places that uses a term that's tied to their state. Nobody says California, I'm a California, or anything like that. And be proud of that, like it's really who we are. I think Texas might be the only place, or even people from Arizona. I don't think anybody claims that strong identity connected to their state, but Texas does. And the word Hispanics, now there's a lot of connection between Hispano and Hispanic. And like Latino, it's a very umbrella term. However, it's a term that emerges out of the 80s too. And it's a term that was given to us. So a lot of people see it as very problematic because it's not something that was decided by us, but rather by somebody else and put on us. And then they play with the word too. They say Hispanic, like my panic, like I'm panicking, right? So a lot of people don't like that term, though it's used particularly in government documents. And then the last one that we have here is the word Chicano. So I'm not sure if your generation might use it as much as previous generations. It actually came about in about the 19 teens. So it's been around for about 100 years. And I'll talk about it later in regards to the history of it. But prior to the 1960s, it had a bit of a negative connotation. Typically, it would be used by our parents and referring to this concept of us being pochos, right now, not true Mexicans. But by the 1960s, the word takes a turn and becomes a very political term, where if you classify yourself as Chicano, you are making a political statement. Today, a lot of people might associate it with like prison gangs because they say there's Chicano gangs in the prisons, but it has that kind of political connotation to it. So mostly it's used in universities, maybe out in protests. A lot of times it's used there too. So it just depends. It's something that's going out of vogue in the maybe last decade, particularly because there's a new term that's been used. You probably heard of it, called Latinx. And, like the word Latino, very umbrella. So some people like it because, it's non-gender and kind of identifies this new generation that's coming about, becoming very political, building coalitions with other Latino groups. At the same time, because it's very umbrella, it doesn't really speak to the concept of who we are as different communities. So maybe in the larger context of the United States, it might be helpful. But some people have seen it as problematic just because, like Latino, right? Me and a Cuban American have nothing in common. Even our politics tend to be very 180. But these are some terms that we'll be using, not all of them, but just want to highlight some for you all to know. Now, the first word that I want you all to know is this concept called a stereotype. So you probably know of a stereotype. You probably use them on your everyday life, right? You kind of make comments about people in very kind of general terms. And there's good stereotypes or bad stereotypes, but they're stereotypes at the end of the day, right? They're very kind of rigid statements that are made about people, and a lot of time they're shaped by an experience that you had with one person, right? You meet an Anglo-American and maybe you have a positive experience with them, and you kind of make that observation about all white people, right? Or whatever, or maybe with women, right? You have an experience with women or an experience with a man, and you assume, oh, all men are this or all women are that, based on this one experience that you've had. Or maybe just a few couple examples, like every man I met has been like this, right? So that's been a common way to kind of create these stereotypes. And the problem with them is that it really leaves no room for a complex identity, because it makes somebody into a cartoon, basically, right? Very one-dimensional type of character. And we know that everybody's very complex when it comes to who they are. You might not see it, but I'm sure if I were to ask you, is your identity complex? Who you are, is that complex? You'll probably say, yeah, I am, Pablo. Nobody understands me type of argument, right? And however, stereotypes kind of just touch the surface of who people are, and again, we apply it to everybody. And the reason why we do this are multiple, right? A lot of times they're created out of hate, out of bad experiences, and they can lead to limit human interaction, right? A lot of times you kind of go, well, I had a bad experience with these type of people, so I'm not going to go and associate with them based on this one experience. It can lead to intolerance and subordination. I'll talk about the word subordination in a little while. But you begin to hate people. You might not even know them, but based on this one experience that you had a long time ago, it shapes your perspective, and you probably might not want to associate with a particular group of people. And it can lead to violence, where people, again, you hate somebody so much, you hate a group of people so much that you can actually physically hurt them. A good example is people who don't like people who are homosexual, right? Just because they're gay, you have this hatred towards them, and it might lead to physical violence against them just because of their sexual preference. It has nothing to do with them and anything that they did to you, just based on this observation that you have of them. A word that I want you to know is this word called, at least to distinguish for this class, is the word oppression and subordination. A lot of times we use them very loosely, and I don't want you to do that, because a lot of times students say, oh, my professor oppresses me, he makes me read all these books. Well, that's not really oppression, right? You have a choice not to read if you don't want. But oppression here, we're going to use it as a form of violence. So when we talk about oppression, we're going to talk about somebody physically attacking another group of people or a person. And so it's something that it's established through violence. And you have a few readings that would highlight that. Whereas subordination is this notion that we begin to think some ideas are common sense. So a good example would be in the 1950s when we had Jim Crow, where African Americans couldn't go into move into certain neighborhoods. And it wasn't against the law, because some neighborhoods allowed anybody to move in, but it became a common sense because they felt so much pressure from the residents not to move into these areas, right? They faced some kind of not violence, but just hatred towards them, that a lot of them said, well, we're not going to move into that place. So it becomes this kind of what we call hegemony, this kind of common sense and acceptance more than anything, right? Well, that's their area, my area is over here. So we kind of take it for granted. It's just, we kind of assume sometimes, well, that's just the way it is. And we go, why? Well, I don't know, but that's just the way it's always been. So we kind of accept it. And we don't question it either. And that's what we mean by subordination. And again, we'll use these words throughout the semester so we can kind of distinguish the differences between them. And then the other word that I want you to know is this concept called cultural imperialism, where one culture is viewed as superior to another. And this kind of has a connection with the concept of assimilation. Throughout history, we were told that if you want to be successful, you gotta act like an American, right? You gotta learn English, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. And you begin to be ashamed of who you were. And that's part of the reason why these classes were established, because we were told that our history was invalid, right? That we had no history, that our people, particularly our ancestors, were barbarians, and that we should look to Europe, right? The Western Civ, to get any kind of form of pride. We begin to feel shame of the way that we look, the color of our skin, the facial features that we have, because they're too indigenous. That we should, our hair is ugly because it's black, that we should bleach it, color it, blonde. And you see all these Mexicans running around with blonde hair, right? That our names are bad names, and they Americanize them. So we go from being Pablo to being Paul, right? And then we begin to accept that, where we kind of go, yeah, don't call me Pablo, call me Paul, right? And we begin to lose our culture because we take this new one, because we've been told ours is bad and this new one's better. It's going to help us succeed. And this is very kind of problematic in our history, because obviously not only does it lead to low self-esteem, but it creates a sense of imperialism, that other cultures are just better than ours. So these are all things we're going to examine in this class. Another term is the term agency. Again, sociology term. The word agency refers to this idea that we can make choices, right? And we all have that ability. I don't care if you're man, woman, Latino, American, white, whatever, right? We all have the ability to make choices. And, a good example is like, you have a choice to read or not to read, right? It doesn't really bother me one way or the other. And that could be a simple form of agency, right? You don't really hurt me, you hurt yourself if you don't want to read. But a lot of times where we see something that's wrong, right? And we can sit there and stay quiet, or we can use our agency and use our voice to help a situation. So obviously you see right now with all the kind of police shootings of African Americans, and it's kind of scary out there, in the sense of, you have COVID out there. It's like, I don't want to go out there and go get sick. But a lot of times you just feel like, something needs to be done. This needs to stop. So many of us could be complicit, stay at home, right? Just watch the news, I guess, and watch TV and live in this little bubble. Or maybe you can use your agency and say, enough is enough. I'm tired of the way, people of color are treated, and I'm going to do something about it. And you actually go out there and you protest. I know this is just a contemporary example, but people have been doing that for years, right? Using your voice to create change. Now, that sounds positive, and it is, but there could also be consequences to those actions. But at the very least, you're using your agency. So it's an achievement, right? Because most of us would probably be complicit. It's like, I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm happy. I got my nice cushy job here as a professor. I'm not going to fight the powers that be. I don't want to get fired, blah, 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 right? But then there's people that say, no, I don't care if I am a professor. I'm going to go out there and protest. I'll risk it all. And so be it, right? Maybe it'll create some change. Maybe it won't. And that's just things you have to do. So it can help create awareness and so forth, or it can hurt you. Maybe the cops come down on you, right? When you're out there protesting, and we've seen it, right? They pepper spray and beat them with batons and shoot this and that at them. And so it can lead to better opportunities. And we'll see that throughout our class, that a lot of times we're not just victims to what's happening. Mexican Americans have reacted to these situations. But it could help us, and we have things like the CHICANA movement, the development of affirmative action, and things like that, right? Things that have helped Latinos. Or it can lead to more oppression and more subordination, right? So, but at the very least, you kind of spoke up. Or we'll look at examples of that too. So I want to cover this concept of postmodernism. Let me preface with this notion that prior to the 1950s, American history was really grounded on Western civilization. When we talked about something like U.S. history, we always started with, the East Coast and kind of worked our way back to the West Coast, right? In a class like this, I always tell students, this is, yes, it's Chicano history, but it's also American history. This is an American history class. It's just that we look at it through a different lens. In America, if you ever take American history, you don't cover everything because it's impossible. Same here. We can't cover all aspects of American history, so we focus on the Mexican-American aspect of it. But it's still American history because we're still covering the United States. So in the 1960s, you have this movement called postmodernism. And postmodernism was a reaction to modernism, right? Post means after. And throughout history, as I noted earlier with cultural imperialism, this notion that Westernization, kind of white European history, was superior to any other history, regardless of who it was, whether it be women's history or gay history or Chicano history or Asian or African American history. And that if we just acted more Western, then we would succeed also. So it has this notion of progress, right? This notion that Western society is moving in a linear way and the rest of us are just playing catch up, right? We're trying to catch up to their, this trail they left behind so we could be like them and succeed too. And, some good things came out of, what's called the modern age, which is roughly about 1900 to about 1950. However, it wasn't, all roses. And we find that to some extent, it didn't even accomplish what it set out to do. Some things did get accomplished. But for the most part, different groups were still disenfranchised. So in the 1960s, you have this French movement called the postmodernists. And people like Foucault and Derrida, there's Michel Foucault, and Derrida kind of come up with this, it's not really an idea because it's more of a challenge to different theories. But they begin to kind of argue this notion that truth is relative, that there's no such thing as complete absolute truth. All truth is relative. And the reason why that is, they actually look at linguists, right? And look at words themselves. And they say, words themselves are a human construction. There's no absolute truth that a table is a table or that a, telephone is a telephone. These are all words that did not come from some God and were implanted in us, but rather we as a society created. Therefore, everything's a human construction. And we've always known this, right? Shakespeare once wrote, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, arguing basically that, if you have a rose, a physical rose, you can call it a globe, you can call it a car, but it doesn't change the meaning. The words themselves have no meaning, right? We can always change those meanings. As long as society agrees with the meaning, then that's the name of this object that we typically call a rose. So we can call a rose a car as long as society agrees that from now on, we're going to call a rose a car, then it's a car, right? So all knowledge is learned rather than pre-existing. So there's no such thing as absolute truth. And normally I do this exercise in class, but I quickly want to show you if you just want to play along here and think of the word apple and see what comes up into your mind. And for many of you, you have these different ideas of apple, right? If it was an absolute truth, then we would all come up with the same thing, but it's not. And here are just some examples. Maybe some of you thought of this, right? The apple, the red apple, typical, stereotypical concept. But then there's also different kinds of apples, right? And a red apple and a green apple probably bring different ideas to your head. One's sweet, one is sour. While others might have thought, of an Apple computer, right? And no longer dealing with something that you eat and that's a fruit, but rather something that's more tech-based, right? Your telephone, your computer, something like that, your iPad. And then others might have thought maybe of a person. I think the little girl's name is Apple. Or even somebody else might have thought of Adam and Eve, right? Now no longer this object that you consume, but rather a story, an origin story of the creation of man, right? The Bible in Genesis of Adam and Eve. So there we see a good example of how, words really have no meaning. And you might go, well, then nothing has meaning. And you would be correct, right? Nothing does have any meaning. However, it does, right? And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, and I don't want to complicate it too much. I'll try to put a video that explains it from somebody else trying to explain this theory too. So postmodernists are challenging this concept of objective truth. And they say, look, truth only exists because we created this notion of quote unquote truth, right? And they say when you look at this concept of truth, you always have this notion of something being superior to something that is inferior. And if society decides, well, this thing is superior over here, then this thing must be inferior. So we could have this debate, try to use a somewhat contemporary example. We could have this argument as to who's a better rapper, Jay-Z or Kanye West. Well, whoever the majority is, let's say the majority say it's Jay-Z, then you become this kind of truth, right? Because the majority dominates the minority. But is that really true? Well, no. Well, then how did we construct truth? Well, it was only because the majority said, Jay-Z was the best. So in order for me to compare one object, in order for us to understand that Jay-Z is better, we need something that's worse. And here we have, as our subject, Kanye West. Right? I can't stand the guy, sorry, for those of you that like him. So in order for me to understand the object, I must have the subject. In reality, nothing has universal meaning, but understand that this is the way truth is created. We create this concept of something being normal against something that we consider abnormal, particularly as a community, as a society. So I'll show you an example with race, but we do it with gender all the time. Men are superior to women, right? And we use certain characteristics based on, well, men are stronger, men are smarter, men are this, men are providers, right? Well, is this really a fact? No, it's just something that was created by society. Men tend to dominate, so they made themselves the object, and they made women inferior, right? They made women the subject. So hopefully you can kind of see how these concepts of truth are created. It's not because it is true, but rather it's because we created it. Another example would be time. Consider what year we're in. I think most of us will agree that we're in 2020. However, what if you use a Muslim calendar, right? Their calendar starts at a different time, right? And all of a sudden it's like, no, I don't know what year it would be under their calendar, but a couple centuries back. Because they start with, I think, Muhammad as kind of like your year one. So probably be like the 1700s or something. Or no, maybe even further back, 1400s. And if somebody were to blurt that out in public, you'll go, well, you're crazy. It's 2020, right? And in reality, they're not wrong because they're just using a different calendar. So there's no absolute truth when it comes to something like that, right? Something so simple. Right? So the concept is that we need, in order to understand that I am right, I need something that we consider wrong. So normally if he's alone, we would consider him, we wouldn't think much of him. But when we compare with somebody who looks totally different, then we decide which one's the object, which one's the subject. All right? And we see it with race. So in reality, you have Europeans, you have people of color, blacks, Latinos, Native Americans. And in its kind of like natural state, we're just humans, right? But throughout history, we have created this notion that one group was superior to another based on different values, could be based on technology or whatever. And through this process, we have kind of created a binary system, right? Europeans become the object, people of color become the subject, right? And then all of a sudden we begin to see people of color as inferior, right? The lazy Mexican or the Jim Crow character. There's kind of like a lot of racist ideas associated with the Jim Crow character. So for many Europeans, kind of like that first lecture I gave you on race, Europeans begin to think, well, if these people of color just acted like us, they'll be more successful, right? The perception that Western civilization civilizes people. So it kind of presents us as kind of barbarians, if you will. And we find that in the 1960s, where this postmodern theory really began to take off, groups began to challenge that idea, saying, do we need to assimilate? Do we need to act white? Do we need to Americanize ourselves in order to be successful? And we've seen people kind of challenge that mentality of assimilation. And that's what we're going to see as we move forward. But again, it's this theory that kind of helps us understand this idea that people do not need to completely let go of their culture in order to be successful. All right, so we'll stop it right there. And then we'll cover, we'll get into the history in the next